October 23, 1942, somewhere past midnight on Guadalcanal. The humid jungle air hung thick with the smell of rotting vegetation and cordite. Rain had fallen earlier that evening, leaving the ground slick with mud that sucked at boots and made every step a struggle. Insects swarmed in clouds so dense that soldiers breathed them in with every gulp of air. The temperature hovered near 90 degrees despite the darkness, and uniforms clung to skin soaked in sweat. Somewhere in the distance, the thump of artillery punctuated the night. Closer, the sounds of men moving through undergrowth, the clink of equipment, and the whispered orders passed from one soldier to the next. Private First Class Genjirou Inui crouched in the undergrowth with his fellow soldiers of the Sendai Division, waiting for the signal to advance toward the American positions around Henderson Field. He gripped his Type 38 Arisaka rifle, the same bolt-action weapon his father might have carried in the Russo-Japanese War nearly 4 decades earlier. The rifle was old but reliable, its chrysanthemum seal marking it as property of the emperor himself. Around him, 3,000 Japanese soldiers prepared to charge across the jungle and overwhelm the American defenders through sheer fighting spirit. Many had tied white cloths around their heads. Some had written final letters to their families, tucked into their uniforms next to photographs of wives and children they might never see again. They had done this before, in China. The charge had always worked. The enemy lines would waver, then break, then collapse into chaos as Japanese bayonets reached them. Spiritual power would triumph over material resistance. This was what they had been taught in years of training. This was what they believed with every fiber of their being. The Americans were soft, they had been told. They lacked fighting spirit. They would crumble when the Emperor's soldiers came at them with cold steel. What happened next would shatter everything Inui and his comrades believed about warfare. When the attack began at approximately 0100 hours, the jungle erupted with a volume of fire unlike anything the Japanese soldiers had ever experienced. It was not the sharp, measured crack of bolt-action rifles they expected, the familiar sound of enemies who had to work their bolts between shots just as they did. It was a continuous roar, a wall of lead that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness like lightning, not in scattered bursts, but in sheets of flame that illuminated the killing ground in stuttering orange light. The sound was overwhelming, a sustained thunder that drowned out the screams of dying men and the shouts of officers trying to maintain control. Men fell by the dozens before they could close the distance. Soldiers who had survived battles across China, who had stormed through Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, who had believed themselves invincible, were cut down in windrows. The jungle floor became slick with blood. Those who survived later described it as facing machine guns in every direction. But there were no machine guns in those American positions. There were only riflemen, each one armed with a weapon that would change the nature of infantry combat forever. This is the story of how one rifle transformed the Pacific War. It is the story of why Japanese soldiers came to believe that every American carried a machine gun. And it is the story of how that belief forced the Imperial Japanese Army to abandon tactics that had served them for generations, driving them underground into the caves and tunnels of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where they would fight and die in a desperate attempt to negate an advantage they could never overcome. The weapon that created this revolution was the M1 Garand, officially designated United States rifle, caliber 30, M1. Its creator was a French-Canadian immigrant named Jean-Baptiste Garand, born in 1888 in the small town of Saint-Rémy, Quebec, about 30 miles south of Montreal. When Garand was 10 years old, his family moved to Connecticut, where his father found work in the textile mills that lined the rivers of New England. The young Garand showed an early aptitude for mechanics, spending his spare time tinkering with machines and tools rather than playing with other children. He taught himself the principles of engineering through observation and experimentation. By 1917, when America entered the First World War, Garand was working as a tool and gauge maker. He submitted his first rifle design to the United States government in 1919, a year after the armistice. The Army was interested enough to hire him as a consulting engineer at Springfield Armory in Massachusetts, the historic facility that had been producing American military weapons since 1777. There, Garand would spend the next 3 decades refining his vision of a semi-automatic infantry rifle that could replace the bolt-action Springfield 1903. The road was long and difficult. Garand tested dozens of different operating systems before settling on a gas-operated design that bled propellant gases from the barrel through a small port to cycle the action. He experimented with primer-actuated designs and recoil-operated systems before determining that gas operation offered the best combination of reliability and simplicity. He faced skepticism from officers who doubted that semi-automatic fire was necessary or even desirable. Many believed that soldiers would waste ammunition if they could fire rapidly, and that the added mechanical complexity would make the rifle unreliable in the field. Garand also endured years of budget cuts during the Great Depression that slowed development to a crawl. The Army's funding for small arms research was minimal, and there were years when progress nearly stopped entirely. But Garand persisted, refining his design through countless iterations, testing prototypes until they failed, and then redesigning them to eliminate the weaknesses. On January 9, 1936, after 17 years of development, the United States Army formally adopted the M1 Garand as its standard service rifle. America became the first nation in the world to equip its entire infantry with semi-automatic weapons. The rifle that Jean Garand had envisioned in a Connecticut workshop had become reality. But production was slow at first. By the time Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, fewer than 400,000 Garands had been manufactured. Most American soldiers and Marines still carried the old bolt-action Springfield. The technical specifications of the Garand explain why it was so devastating in combat once it reached the battlefield in large numbers. The rifle weighed just over 9 pounds unloaded and measured 43.6 inches in overall length. It fired the powerful .30-06 Springfield cartridge, the same round used in the M1903 Springfield bolt-action rifle it replaced. The .30-06 propelled a 150-grain bullet at a muzzle velocity of 2,800 feet per second, delivering tremendous energy at ranges well beyond typical infantry engagement distances. The round could penetrate steel helmets and light cover at ranges exceeding 500 yards. The Garand fed from an 8-round en bloc clip that inserted directly into the internal magazine with a distinctive clicking sound. When the last round was fired, the empty clip was automatically ejected with an audible ping, a sound that would become famous among veterans of the war. Some soldiers learned to throw empty clips against rocks to deceive enemies into thinking they were reloading, though this tactic was less common than Hollywood would later suggest. Most importantly, the gas-operated action cycled automatically after each shot. When the rifle fired, propellant gases traveled down the barrel behind the bullet. Near the muzzle, some of these gases were bled off through a small port into a cylinder beneath the barrel. This gas pressure pushed against a piston that drove the operating rod backward, unlocking the rotating bolt and ejecting the spent casing. A spring then pushed the mechanism forward, stripping a fresh round from the magazine and chambering it while relocking the bolt. All of this happened in a fraction of a second, faster than a soldier could possibly work a bolt action by hand. A soldier could fire, and the rifle would eject the spent casing, chamber a new round, and reset the hammer without the shooter ever moving his hands from the firing position. He never lost his sight picture. He never broke his concentration. He never had to shift his grip or take his eye off the target. He simply pulled the trigger again. The practical rate of fire was extraordinary by the standards of the era. A trained soldier could deliver 16 to 24 aimed shots per minute under normal conditions. Under favorable conditions at moderate range, experienced soldiers achieved 40 to 50 aimed rounds per minute. A rifleman could empty an entire 8-round clip in under 6 seconds at close range, producing a rapid succession of shots that was virtually indistinguishable from automatic fire to anyone on the receiving end. The weapon that Japanese soldiers carried into battle against the Garand was the Type 99 Arisaka, a bolt-action rifle adopted in 1939 to replace the older Type 38. The Type 99 was chambered in the more powerful 7.7 by 58 mm cartridge, a round designed to match the ballistics of Western rifle ammunition. It was accurate, reliable, and well suited to the marksmanship traditions of the Japanese infantry. The bolt action was smooth and fast for its type, incorporating features drawn from the German Mauser design that had proven itself in wars around the world. But it was still a bolt-action rifle, fundamentally unchanged in its operating principle from weapons designed in the 1890s. After each shot, the soldier had to lift the bolt handle with his right hand, pull it back to eject the spent casing, push it forward to strip a new round from the 5-round internal magazine, and lock the bolt down before he could fire again. This manual operation required the shooter to break his cheek weld, shift his grip, and reacquire the target between shots. Even for a well-trained soldier, working the bolt took time. The practical rate of fire was limited to 10 to 15 aimed rounds per minute. The older Type 38 Arisaka, which many Japanese soldiers still carried throughout the war, was chambered in the smaller 6.5 by 50 mm cartridge. It was an accurate rifle with light recoil, but its smaller bullet lacked the stopping power of larger caliber rounds. Both rifles fed from 5-round internal magazines, loaded by stripper clips, meaning soldiers had to reload more frequently than their American counterparts. And both rifles required the same manual bolt operation that limited rate of fire, regardless of how skilled the shooter might be. The mathematics of the firepower gap were brutal and unforgiving. An American rifleman could deliver 3 to 4 times as many aimed shots as his Japanese counterpart in the same amount of time. In a firefight, this advantage multiplied across the entire formation. A standard American infantry squad consisted of 12 men, organized around fire and maneuver principles. 11 carried M1 Garands, each capable of 20 to 50 aimed rounds per minute, depending on conditions. One carried the M1918, A2 Browning automatic rifle, a magazine-fed weapon capable of 120 to 150 rounds per minute in automatic fire from its 20-round magazine. The combined theoretical output of the American squad reached roughly 560 to 700 aimed rounds per minute. A standard Japanese infantry squad consisted of 13 men. One NCO served as squad leader. One soldier carried and operated the Type 96 or Type 99 light machine gun, with the remaining 11 men serving as riflemen, who also carried ammunition for the automatic weapon. The riflemen carried bolt-action Arisaka rifles, with their practical rate of 10 to 15 rounds per minute. The combined output reached approximately 210 to 255 rounds per minute. The ratio was roughly 3-to-1 in favor of the Americans at the squad level. When artillery, mortars, and crew-served weapons were added, the disparity grew even worse. The spring and summer of 1942 found the Imperial Japanese Army at the height of its conquests. Japanese forces had swept through Southeast Asia with stunning speed in the months following Pearl Harbor. Hong Kong fell on Christmas Day, 1941, after 18 days of fighting. Manila was declared an open city on January 2, 1942, and Japanese troops marched in unopposed. Singapore, the supposedly impregnable British fortress at the tip of the Malay Peninsula, surrendered on February 15 after just 7 days of fighting, delivering over 80,000 prisoners into Japanese hands in the largest British military surrender in history. The Dutch East Indies capitulated on March 8. Burma was overrun by May. Everywhere the Japanese soldier went, victory followed. The image of the Japanese military as an unstoppable force was reinforced by each new conquest. Allied prisoners in their hundreds of thousands marched into captivity. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere expanded to encompass an empire stretching from the borders of India to the islands of the Central Pacific, from the frozen Aleutians to the jungles of New Guinea. It was the most rapid military expansion in human history, and it seemed to validate everything the Japanese military believed about itself. The confidence of the Imperial Japanese Army rested on a doctrine that had been developing since the Meiji Restoration of 1868, when Japan emerged from centuries of isolation and set about transforming itself into a modern military power. Japanese military thinkers studied Western methods carefully, adopting German organizational principles and French tactical concepts, but they also insisted on uniquely Japanese elements rooted in the samurai tradition. The warrior spirit, they believed, was Japan's unique advantage over materially superior enemies. Japanese infantry training manuals from this era emphasized that the enemy could not be defeated by shooting alone. In the end, hand-to-hand combat was inevitable. This was not merely rhetoric, it was the foundation of Japanese infantry doctrine. Japanese soldiers trained relentlessly with the bayonet. Drill after drill emphasized the charge, the scream, the thrust. Training programs devoted extraordinary amounts of time to close combat techniques that Western armies had largely abandoned after the First World War demonstrated the dominance of the machine gun. The standard Type 30 bayonet measured 20 inches long an exceptionally large blade by the standards of any army. Mounted on the Type 38 rifle, which at 50.4 inches was already the longest infantry rifle of the Second World War, the combination exceeded 65 inches in length. It was a pike, a weapon designed not merely for utility but for the psychological impact of the charge. Japanese soldiers were taught that the sight of these blades would terrify enemies into breaking before the charge even reached them. This doctrine had worked brilliantly in China throughout the 1930s. The Second Sino-Japanese War, which began in earnest in 1937, provided years of validation for offensive tactics. Japanese troops faced opponents armed with bolt-action, Mauser rifles imported from Germany and often inferior training compared to the highly professional Imperial Army. When Japanese soldiers fixed bayonets and charged, screaming their battle cry of Banzai, meaning 10,000 years, the Chinese lines frequently broke. The charge succeeded because both sides operated at roughly the same rate of fire. What the Japanese lacked in numbers they made up in discipline, aggression, and willingness to accept casualties that would have been considered catastrophic by Western standards. The High Command believed that spiritual willpower could overcome material disadvantage. Excessive reliance on materiel was considered a modern evil that would destroy fighting spirit. War Minister Hideki Tojo, who would later serve as Prime Minister during the Pacific War, expressed this philosophy directly when he stated that Japan's real strength lay in her spiritual superiority. Western nations might have more factories and more resources, but Japan had warriors who did not fear death. This philosophy was not merely theoretical. It shaped every aspect of how the Japanese military prepared for war. When Japanese ordnance officers examined semi-automatic rifle designs in the early 1930s, they encountered resistance from conservative senior officers who believed that such weapons would waste ammunition and encourage soldiers to rely on firepower rather than fighting spirit. The Americans are too dependent on materiel, these officers argued. That is their weakness, not their strength. Japan had actually experimented with semi-automatic rifles. In 1931, the Army began testing various designs. In 1935, they even invited American firearms designer John Pedersen to Japan to demonstrate his toggle-locked semi-automatic rifle. But every program stalled against the same obstacles. Manufacturing precision was insufficient for the tight tolerances required by semi-automatic mechanisms. Resources were scarce and needed for aircraft, ships, and tanks. And conservative officers continued to argue that rapid-fire weapons would deplete ammunition supplies and make soldiers dependent on logistics rather than spirit. The semi-automatic rifle programs were abandoned in favor of other priorities. Resources went to aircraft, to ships, to the weapons that would enable Japan to strike across the Pacific. The infantry would continue to rely on bolt-action rifles and the bayonet charge, just as they had for decades. Far from the jungles of Southeast Asia, in the orderly barracks of American training camps, a different philosophy was taking shape. The United States Army treated the rifle as a firepower delivery system. The goal was not to close with the enemy for hand-to-hand combat, but to destroy him with accurate, rapid fire at a distance. Bayonets were carried, of course, but they were considered weapons of last resort rather than the primary infantry tool. Training at the infantry school at Fort Benning, Georgia, progressed through 6 carefully designed stages. Soldiers first learned the fundamentals of aiming, understanding sight picture and sight alignment. They studied the mechanics of the rifle, learning how the gas system operated and how to maintain the weapon in field conditions. They then studied firing positions, learning to shoot accurately from standing, kneeling, sitting, and prone. Trigger squeeze came next, the gradual pressure that released the shot without disturbing the aim. Only then did they progress to rapid fire. Rapid fire training was considered one of the most important elements of infantry instruction. Soldiers built speed incrementally, starting with deliberate single shots and gradually increasing tempo until they could achieve 25 or more accurate shots per minute while maintaining proper form. The semi-automatic action of the M1 Garand made this possible in a way that no bolt-action rifle could match. A soldier did not have to sacrifice accuracy for speed because his hands never left the rifle. The American squad was organized around fire and maneuver tactics. Riflemen did not simply shoot at the enemy. They provided a base of fire while other elements maneuvered to attack from advantageous positions. The Browning automatic rifle provided sustained automatic fire, pinning the enemy in place. The semi-automatic Garands allowed every rifleman to contribute rapid, accurate fire without the physical and mental disruption of working a bolt action between shots. Every man in the squad was a source of significant firepower. The first shots of the M1 Garand in combat were fired in the Philippines in December 1941, just hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Philippine Division included the 45th and 57th Philippine Scouts, elite units that had been re-equipped with the new rifle between August and November of that year. When Japanese forces landed on Luzon, these soldiers encountered something unexpected. Military historian John W. Whitman later wrote in his book on the Patton campaign that both the Americans and Scouts carried the new semi-automatic M1 Garand rifle. Its 8-round clip and rapid fire of 20 to 30 aimed shots a minute surprised the first Japanese to come up against it. General Douglas MacArthur cabled the War Department praising the rifle's performance in combat, but the Philippines fell anyway. The defenders were overwhelmed by numbers, cut off from reinforcement, starved into submission. Patton surrendered on April 9, 1942. Corregidor held out until May 6. The M1 Garand had proven itself in combat, but its potential remained unrealized. Most American forces still carried bolt-action Springfields. That would change at Guadalcanal. On August 7, 1942, the 1st Marine Division landed on the island of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands. This was the first American offensive of the Pacific War, a counterstroke designed to halt Japanese expansion toward Australia. The Marines seized the partially constructed Japanese airfield and renamed it Henderson Field after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at the Battle of Midway. The initial Marine landing force was equipped primarily with the M1903 Springfield, the same bolt-action rifle that American soldiers had carried through the trenches of France in the First World War. The Marines had only a limited number of M1 Garands on the entire island, with most riflemen still carrying the older bolt-action weapons. The semi-automatic advantage that had surprised the Japanese in the Philippines was largely absent. The Japanese response came swiftly. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki landed with his detachment of 900 men on the night of August 18. Supremely confident in the spirit of his soldiers, he attacked with only half his force the following night, convinced that such overwhelming martial spirit would scatter the Americans without needing his full strength. The Battle of the Tenaru, sometimes called the Battle of Alligator Creek, ended in disaster. Marine machine guns and artillery cut down the charging Japanese soldiers. Over 800 men of the Ichiki detachment were killed. Colonel Ichiki burned his regimental colors and shot himself rather than face the shame of defeat. But the real transformation came on October 13, 1942. That night, the transport ships carrying the 164th Infantry Regiment of the United States Army arrived at Guadalcanal. These soldiers from the North Dakota National Guard carried M1 Garands, every rifleman among them, within days. They would face the largest Japanese offensive of the entire Guadalcanal campaign. General Masao Maruyama led approximately 3,000 soldiers of the Sendai Division against the Marine and Army positions around Henderson Field. On the nights of October 23 through 26, 1942, the Japanese plan called for a classic infantry assault, overwhelming the defenders through aggressive close-quarters combat. The soldiers had marched for days through brutal jungle terrain to reach their attack positions. They were exhausted, short on rations, weakened by malaria and dysentery, but they were confident. They expected to face bolt-action rifles like their own, to close with the enemy and destroy him with the bayonet. What they encountered was unprecedented. When the Japanese soldiers emerged from the jungle and charged toward the American lines, they ran into a wall of semi-automatic fire. Light, medium and heavy machine guns combined with hundreds of new Garand rifles to create a continuous roar of gunfire that shattered the darkness. The combined Marine and Army positions cut down the attackers in waves. Over 1,500 Japanese soldiers fell in front of the American lines. The 164th Infantry, fighting alongside the Marines of the 1st Battalion 7th Marines, suffered 26 killed and 52 wounded. The exchange ratio was staggering. Second Lieutenant Genjirou Inui survived the Guadalcanal campaign. He served as platoon leader of the 8th Independent Anti-Tank Gun Company attached to the Ichiki detachment. He kept a diary from August 30, 1942, to February 7, 1943, which his family later published privately in 1992 under the title My Guadalcanal. His words captured the shock that Japanese soldiers experienced when they encountered American firepower. He wrote that their firepower had overwhelmed us, and we had put too much confidence in our charging power. Only after our superior firepower can compete with their superior firepower will the charging power of the Imperial Army win a victory. He wished to say, root out the old concept of the battle. He also noted that a shortage of firepower will force us into inconsistent battles, double our losses, and must raise the morale of the enemy. These were not the words of a defeated man seeking excuses. They were the clear-eyed observations of a professional soldier who recognized that the fundamental assumptions of Japanese infantry doctrine were wrong. The bayonet charge, the cornerstone of Japanese tactics for decades, had failed against an enemy who could fire 3 or 4 times as fast. The perception that Americans carried machine guns was not merely a figure of speech or battlefield exaggeration. Japanese soldiers genuinely could not believe that ordinary rifles could produce such a volume of fire. The sound was wrong. The tempo was wrong. Everything they knew about infantry combat told them that this could not be rifle fire. An unnamed Japanese soldier on Okinawa later recorded in his diary that he was really surprised at the amount of ammunition that the enemy has. When friendly forces fire 1 round, he wrote, at least 10 rounds are guaranteed to come back. The 10-to-1 ratio perception exceeded even the actual rate of fire differential, suggesting that the psychological impact of combined American firepower felt even more overwhelming than the numbers alone would predict. At the institutional level, Japanese military planners formally calculated the firepower gap. The staff of the 32nd Army on Okinawa, led by Senior Operations Officer Colonel Hiromichi Yahara, assessed that superior quality and numbers of weapons gave each United States division 5 or 6 times the firepower of a Japanese division. This was not an informal impression. It was a staff assessment captured in planning documents, an acknowledgement at the highest levels that the fundamental balance of infantry combat had shifted against Japan. The legend that Japanese prisoners of war specifically stated that they believed every American carried a machine gun has circulated for decades in military history and popular culture. The most commonly cited source is Earl McFarland, who served as commanding officer at Springfield Armory during the war. In a speech to factory workers designed to boost morale and production, McFarland stated that captured Japanese soldiers inquired how America was able to arm every soldier with a machine gun. These were not machine guns, McFarland said. They were M1 rifles. This statement must be understood in its proper context. McFarland was delivering a motivational speech at a weapons factory, encouraging workers to maintain high production. No specific prisoner names, unit designations, or interrogation document numbers accompany the claim. The Allied translator and interpreter section produced 779 interrogation reports based on over 14,000 Japanese prisoners of war, and these records reside at the National Archives. However, no digitized or widely published report containing the exact machine gun quote has been identified by researchers. This matters for historical accuracy. The firepower gap was real. The Japanese shock at American rifle fire was documented in diaries and official assessments. But the specific prisoner, quote, should be attributed to the McFarland speech rather than presented as a confirmed interrogation transcript. The documented evidence, from soldiers like Genjirou Inui and from official Japanese military assessments, tells the same story without the need for unverifiable quotations. The Marines, who had landed on Guadalcanal with Springfield bolt-action rifles, learned quickly that they wanted Garands. When Army units arrived on the island with the new semi-automatic rifles, Marines began stealing them so aggressively that when the 1st Marine Division departed in December 1942, Army officers had to be stationed at embarkation points to confiscate pilfered weapons. By 1943, Marine divisions were authorized over 7,400 M1 Garands per division, with the old Springfield relegated to snipers and grenadiers who benefited from its superior accuracy at long range. The catastrophic failure of banzai charges did not immediately change Japanese doctrine. The Army High Command remained committed to offensive spirit, even as the evidence mounted that such tactics were suicidal against American firepower. The battles of 1943 and early 1944 repeated the same pattern across the Pacific. Japanese soldiers charged. American rifles cut them down. The bodies piled up on beaches and in jungles from Tarawa to New Guinea. At Tarawa in November 1943, Japanese defenders fought from fortified positions rather than charging, but reinforcements who attempted counterattacks were annihilated. At Saipan in July 1944, the old doctrine reached its final bloody conclusion. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito commanded the Japanese garrison on Saipan in the Marianas Chain. American forces had landed on June 15th, and by early July, Saito's forces had been driven into the northern tip of the island. Ammunition was running low, food was scarce. Reinforcement was impossible. Defeat was certain. Rather than surrender, Saito ordered the largest banzai charge of the entire Pacific War. His final order read that he would advance with those who remained to deliver still another blow to the American devils. He then committed ritual suicide by the traditional method. Approximately 3,000 to 4,300 Japanese combatants, many armed only with sharpened bamboo or bayonets because they had no ammunition left, charged the positions of the 105th Infantry Regiment in pre-dawn darkness on July 7th. American defenders poured M1 Garand fire, machine gun fire, and 37mm canister rounds into the advancing waves for more than 12 hours. The fighting was desperate at times, with Japanese soldiers breaking through the initial lines in some places. But the outcome was never in doubt. When the killing finally ended, over 4,300 Japanese soldiers lay dead. American losses were 406 killed and 512 wounded. Saipan proved beyond any doubt that offensive tactics against American firepower meant annihilation. The traditional banzai charge, which had worked against Chinese armies, and even against poorly equipped early war Allied forces, was suicide against an enemy armed with semi-automatic rifles. In mid-August 1944, Japanese High Command issued a provisional tactical manual on island defense, calling for hardened positions and protracted defense. It was the first formal repudiation of Banzai doctrine. A Japanese battalion commander on Leyte told his officers in November 1944 that the tactics we have been using against an enemy with superior firepower only increase our losses. The tactical revolution found its ultimate expression on Iwo Jima. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi was assigned to command the defense of this tiny volcanic island in June 1944. Unlike many Japanese generals, Kuribayashi understood America. He had served as deputy military attaché in the United States from around 1928 to 1930. He had traveled across the country, visited automobile factories in Detroit, and observed military training exercises, studied American industrial methods. He wrote to his wife that the United States is the last country in the world that Japan should fight. Kuribayashi designed a defense specifically to negate American firepower advantages. He explicitly prohibited banzai charges, calling them a futile waste of resources. Instead, he ordered his soldiers to dig. They constructed 11 miles of underground tunnels, some reaching 75 feet below the volcanic rock. Bunkers were connected by passageways that allowed defenders to retreat, reposition, and emerge behind American lines. Artillery and mortars were pre-registered on the beaches where Marines would land. Each soldier was ordered to kill 10 of the enemy before dying. When American Marines landed on Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945, they expected the island to fall in 5 days. Naval guns had bombarded it for 3 days straight. Carrier aircraft had pounded Japanese positions repeatedly. Surely nothing could survive such punishment. For the first 20 minutes after the landing, nothing happened. The Marines advanced inland, confused by the silence. Then Kuribayashi gave the order, and the island exploded. Japanese artillery, mortars, and machine guns opened fire from positions the Americans could not see. The volcanic sand made movement almost impossible. Tanks bogged down to their hulls. Men crawled forward under fire that seemed to come from the earth itself. The battle lasted 36 days instead of 5. American casualties reached approximately 26,000, including nearly 7,000 killed. It was the only major Pacific battle where total American casualties exceeded total Japanese losses, though Japanese combat deaths outnumbered American deaths by nearly 3 to 1. General Holland Smith, commanding the Marines, called Kuribayashi the most redoubtable of all Japanese adversaries. Kuribayashi had found the answer to American firepower. Not better rifles, but better fortifications. If Japanese soldiers could not survive in the open against the M1 Garand, they would fight from underground, where rapid fire meant nothing. Every American advance would be bought in blood, one bunker at a time. Okinawa applied the same logic on an even larger scale. The Japanese 32nd Army constructed elaborate defensive positions around the Shuri Line in southern Okinawa. They dug into natural caves that honeycombed the limestone ridges, connected them with tunnels, and fortified them with concrete. Artillery positions were placed in reverse slope defilade, where naval gunfire could not reach them. Machine gun nests covered every approach with interlocking fields of fire. The defenders had learned from Iwo Jima and improved upon Kuribayashi's methods. When American forces landed on April 1, 1945, they initially met little resistance. The landing beaches on the western coast were lightly defended. Soldiers waded ashore, expecting the worst, and found themselves walking inland, almost unopposed. Some thought the Japanese had abandoned the island. They had not. They were waiting in the south, in the most formidable defensive positions of the entire Pacific War. When the Americans reached the main defensive positions around Shuri Castle, the killing began in earnest. Every ridge was a fortress. Every cave was a bunker. The Japanese had prepared for this fight for months, and they intended to make the Americans pay for every yard of ground. The fighting devolved into brutal close-quarters combat, room to room and tunnel to tunnel. Flamethrowers became essential weapons. Tanks were brought forward to fire directly into cave mouths. The Japanese tried one major counteroffensive on May 3rd and 4th. It was a gamble, an attempt to break the American lines before they could be reinforced. The attack included amphibious landings behind American lines and was supported by over 13,000 rounds of artillery. The attack failed disastrously, with Japanese casualties exceeding 6,500 killed and wounded. The 32nd Army staff concluded that the Americans were vulnerable to night infiltration tactics, but that their superior firepower made any offensive Japanese troop concentrations extremely dangerous. They returned to the defensive strategy that had proven so costly at Iwo Jima. The Battle of Okinawa lasted 82 days, from April 1st to June 21st, 1945. American casualties exceeded 50,000, including over 12,000 killed. It was the costliest battle of the Pacific War for American forces. Japanese military deaths exceeded 100,000. Perhaps most tragically, civilian casualties were staggering, with estimates ranging from 40,000 to over 100,000, depending on how conscripted Okinawans are counted. The inhabitants of Okinawa were caught between two armies, and some were forced by Japanese soldiers to commit suicide rather than surrender. The fighting demonstrated both the effectiveness and the limitations of the new Japanese defensive doctrine. The fortifications negated much of the American firepower advantage, but they could not prevent the inevitable outcome, only delay it. The M1 Garand could not be defeated by digging deeper. It could only be made to cost more in time and blood. And America had both to spare, while Japan did not. The strongest institutional evidence that Japan recognized the firepower gap is found not on the battlefield, but in the workshops of Yokosuka Naval Arsenal. There, beginning in early 1944, Japanese engineers attempted to copy the M1 Garand itself. It was an acknowledgement, at the highest levels of the Japanese military establishment, that the semi-automatic rifle had proven itself superior to the bolt action in combat. The program began after captured M1 Garands from the Philippines were shipped to Japan for evaluation. 10 captured rifles were rechambered to 7.7mm for testing, and the results were highly satisfactory. The Japanese Navy, whose elite special naval landing forces had repeatedly faced American firepower and suffered devastating casualties as a result, wanted the same capability for their own troops. The result was designated the Type 4 rifle, sometimes called the Type 5 in some sources. It was a near-direct copy of the Garand, modified to accommodate Japanese manufacturing capabilities and ammunition. The engineers replaced the en-bloc clip feeding system with a 10-round integral magazine fed by 2 standard 5-round stripper clips. This change was made because Japan lacked the precision manufacturing capacity to produce the en-bloc clips reliably. Japanese tangent sights replaced American aperture sights. The lockup system was simplified. The trigger mechanism was redesigned. Development proceeded slowly. The engineers at Yokosuka had other priorities, including anti-aircraft weapons and naval equipment. The Type 4 was essentially a spare-time project, worked on when resources and personnel were available. Testing revealed problems with feeding and jamming that required redesign work. The gas system proved difficult to tune for Japanese ammunition, which had different pressure characteristics than American .30-06. Fewer than 200 rifles were produced before Japan surrendered in August 1945. Estimates vary, with leading researchers concluding that between 50 and 125 rifles were actually assembled from part sets. They suffered from persistent jamming and feed problems that were never fully resolved. They were never formally standardized or assigned an official designation by the Japanese military. None saw combat. The war ended before the design could be perfected, let alone put into production. Even had the Type 4 succeeded, Japan could never have produced it in meaningful numbers. The precision manufacturing required for a reliable semi-automatic rifle was beyond Japan's wartime industrial capacity. Springfield Armory alone manufactured over 3,900 M1 Garands per day at peak production in January 1944. When Winchester Repeating Arms Company production was added, American factories were turning out well over 5,000 semi-automatic rifles every single day. Total wartime production reached approximately 4 million M1 Garands. Japan's collapsing industrial base, starved of raw materials by American submarine warfare and bombing, could not begin to match this output. Even if the Type 4 had worked perfectly, Japan could have built perhaps a few thousand per year at most. Several Type 4 rifles survive today in museum collections, where they serve as objects of historical curiosity. The National Rifle Association Museum in Virginia holds one. The Cody Firearms Museum in Wyoming displays another with serial number 8. The National Firearms Center in the United Kingdom has additional examples. They stand as silent testimony to Japan's desperate attempt to close a gap that could never be closed, monuments to a technological race that Japan entered too late and with too few resources to win. General George S. Patton called the M1 Garand the greatest battle implement ever devised. He made this statement in a letter to Major General Levin H. Campbell, Jr. On January 26, 1945, after observing the rifle's performance in combat, it became one of the most famous endorsements of any weapon in military history. The rifle that Jean Garand designed in a Massachusetts armory helped drive an empire that had conquered half of Asia into caves and tunnels from which it could not emerge. The men who carried the M1 Garand across the Pacific are nearly all gone now. The veterans who stormed the beaches of Guadalcanal and Tarawa, who fought through the jungles of New Guinea and the Philippines, who clawed their way up the black sand slopes of Iwo Jima and through the mud and blood of Okinawa, have passed into history. The youngest of them, if still living today, would be nearly 100 years old. But their rifles remain. The M1 Garand served on through the Korean War, where it once again proved its worth against massed infantry attacks at places like the Chosin Reservoir and Pork Chop Hill. Chinese and North Korean soldiers learned the same lesson that Japanese soldiers had learned a decade earlier. The semi-automatic rifle had changed infantry combat permanently. The M1 Garand was finally replaced as the standard American service rifle by the M14 in 1957, though many Garands remained in service through the early years of the Vietnam War and continue to be used by ceremonial units to this day. Hundreds of thousands of M1 Garands were sold to American civilians through the civilian marksmanship program over the decades following the war. They hang on walls in homes across America. They fill gun safes alongside hunting rifles and shotguns. They are still fired on ranges by enthusiasts who appreciate both the engineering excellence and the historical significance of the weapon. The distinctive ping of the ejected en bloc clip remains one of the most recognizable sounds in American military history. Featured in countless films and television programs about the Second World War, Jean Garand himself lived to see his rifle become legendary. He remained at Springfield Armory until his retirement in 1953, continuing to work on weapons design until the end. He received numerous awards and honors for his contribution to American victory, though Congress never granted him the $1 million bonus that some legislators proposed. He died in 1974 at the age of 86. Remembered as one of the most important firearms designers in American history, The Japanese soldiers who faced the Garand and believed they were fighting men armed with machine guns were not fools or cowards. They were professional soldiers, many of them veterans of years of combat in China, confronting a technological revolution for which they had no answer. Their perception was wrong in its details, for the M1 Garand was indeed a semi-automatic rifle rather than a machine gun, but their perception was correct in its essence. They were outgunned. The rate of fire that American riflemen could achieve was fundamentally different from anything they had ever encountered. The age of the bolt-action rifle, which had dominated infantry warfare since the 1880s, was ending. The age of the semi-automatic had begun. The Imperial Japanese Army believed that courage and fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantage. This belief had been validated by decades of victory. From the Russo-Japanese War through the conquest of China, the M1 Garand proved that belief tragically wrong. No amount of spiritual power could overcome a 3-to-1 disadvantage in rate of fire. No bayonet charge could succeed when every defender could fire 40 aimed rounds per minute. Japan adapted with the cave warfare of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, finding tactical solutions to a strategic problem. But adaptation came too late to change the outcome of the war. The Type 4 rifle sits in museums as evidence of what might have been, a technological road not taken because Japan's military culture and industrial capacity could not support it. And the M1 Garand endures, in museums and private collections and ceremonial armories around the world, as the rifle that changed how infantry wars were fought, and proved that, in modern combat, firepower matters as much as fighting spirit.